Hello there! So I made this video to help beginners or even returning players to know what decks are currently in the meta. And yeah, enjoy! This is an aggressive deck that uses the new vehicle amulets to its greatest extent. The deck has excellent early game, being able to buff its own followers to be stronger than it's supposed to be on earlier turns. And not only that, but this deck also has cards that can apply aggression to not only the enemy's leader, but the enemy's board as well. And even if the followers on the early game are destroyed, the deck still has storm cards like Hammer Monkey, Elven Pikeman, and Sukuna that can help to finish the game before the late game comes. Overall, this deck is definitely an excellent one, and it's also one of the easier decks to use as it's an aggressive one. The only downside to this deck is that it loses to certain hyper defensive control decks such as Answer Haven. This deck relies on one card, and that card's name is Loxus. The deck basically sits down and does absolutely nothing scary on the first 4 turns. But on turn 5, this is where things take a turn. Loxus comes out, and this guy makes it possible to play so many cards in a turn by cycling amulets. With this asset in mind, good players can take advantage of it and make massive boards by playing 6 to even 8 cards in that one turn. Setting up a board like this can put a lot of pressure on the opponent. And with so many different types of amulets destroyed on the Loxus turn, this deck can end the game with Sukuna dealing massive damage to the face, or Shamu Shama, which can be bounced back to hand so it can hit its opponent multiple times. However, sometimes the deck will have consistency issues as it relies on Loxus so much, so having a game without him will hurt. But overall, this deck is definitely an excellent one. It has one of the highest pick rates in recent tournaments, and I'm definitely happy Forest gets their place on this meta. This deck is the main protagonist of Shadowverse. It takes advantage of the evolve mechanic and exaggerates it. The deck can evolve up to 6 or 7 times in a match, which is around twice the amount that you're supposed to. Then the deck has some cards that rewards you for evolving so many cards in that match, such as Luxblade Ariat, Resolve of the Fallen, and so much more. The deck applies good pressure from start to finish, and not to mention, it has excellent board control, especially with newer cards like Knock Knot and Reinhardt covering the defenses that the deck used to lack. And it can also end the game in massive burst damage thanks to Rivayle Wildcat, which can give another follower Storm. And yeah, this is definitely, in no exaggeration, an S tier deck in the current meta. It does its job well against almost every deck other than the hyper gimmick ones like whatever Shadowcraft has. If you see this deck on a preview, you'd be very confused as to why the deck has so many expensive cost cards. But no worry, because as you play the spell cards in the game, all these expensive cards in your hand will have their cost reduced by 1 PP. So the deck's objective is to reduce the cost of these cards so that they can be thrown out as early as possible. Kuon, especially, is a powerhouse to the deck, giving you so many followers when you play it, while also spell boosting the hand again, reducing the cost of more upcoming followers. However, the deck does lack early game defense, so that's something to watch out for. But on the later game, this deck can have both solid defense and balanced by a solid offense too. It is one of the more difficult decks to play, but once you know how the deck works, you're gonna roll. This deck relies on Vincent, and Vincent has so many words! What he basically does is that whenever you buff someone, you put this spell into your hand. And what this spell does is that it silences enemy followers, disabling their effects. And every 3 spells of the same name, it's going to AoE burst the enemy's board while also dealing damage to the leader. It also runs Miser, which also does excellently in terms of board control, while also doing burn damage to the face on later turns. Overall, this is a defensive monster of a deck. It just shuts down any board setup that the opponent has with no problems at all. The only downside is that the opponent can play around it by not playing any followers so that the Vincent spells can't be played. It also doesn't have a defense mechanism to help them deal with aggressive decks. But overall, this deck does what it does best, which is snipe Haven, and I'm happy that this deck exists. This deck is cheating because you can get free playpoint orbs, meaning you can play more expensive cost cards on earlier turns. Then Shipsbane plus Theosaurus comes out earlier than it's supposed to, which makes it so that every time a card is discarded, it shoots the enemy leader and the enemy follower. So players generally want to discard a lot of cards to activate this effect, clearing the opponent's board and hitting them in the face. It's also balanced with enough draws and cycles to sustain the player's hand even after all that discard. It also has a lot of burst damage from hand, being Reggie and Dark Prison Dragon, which can burst for more than 10 damage in a single turn on mid to late game. Although this deck does suffer a bit in the early game, especially against aggro decks because they spend their early turns ramping. But overall, it is an excellent deck, it's really cool and it really is fun to play as well. This deck also cheats because that's what every dragon player does. They ramp. So this deck's objective is to throw out as many natural and great trees as possible. The deck is mostly underwhelming until Valdain comes into play. Valdain's Shadow Corrosion lets you deal damage based on how many trees are destroyed every turn. This continuous burn damage combined with finishers like Ernst makes it possible to hit lethal damage even on very high numbers. And trust me, this is gonna do most of the lethal job for you, cause it really hurts. Overall, this deck is a scaling monster that destroys any other late game decks. It does have a slow early game, but dang is that late game scary. This is easily the most aggressive deck in the format. The deck runs a lot of low cost followers that are sticky to the board, making it really strong as early game threats. There's also Grudge Teller, an extremely aggressive follower that can be revived with some of the other cards in the deck to deal more damage. The deck also has really strong Storm cards, which makes it very possible to end games on turn 5. Even defenses above 10 are sometimes reachable with the help of Necro Impulse. However, as the deck runs out of hand very quickly, it is very easy to lose the game if the deck can't finish games off quick enough. Just like any other aggro decks, it loses to any hyper defensive decks. But overall, the deck is still really good, it's very straightforward to play, and it works really well in the current meta. This deck's purpose is to generate shadows as fast as possible. By killing its own followers and drawing cards, the deck wants to invoke Grammary by around turn 7. When Grammary's effect comes into play, this is where the power spike begins, as the player now has access to up to 14 PP in a single turn. Especially with the help of Invincible Monster Trio, the deck can generate insanely big defensive boards while also pressuring the leader by dealing face damage. It's so strong that it just becomes very hard to win against this deck once it gets their Grammary invoked. However, the early game of the deck is one of the weakest in the format right now, as it can't really pressure aggressively, meaning the deck will only play defense until Grammary comes. The nerf to Invincible Monster Trio also hurts the deck quite significantly, but regardless, it's still a strong deck overall. The deck's main star is Ravening Corruption. On evolve, it gives the effect of every time you draw a card, you ping an enemy by 1 damage. That's why most cards in this deck draws you cards, as all the other cards want to get full value from Ravening Corruption's evolve. Especially the other star of the deck, Baal, which can draw you so many cards at once and also potentially clean the enemy's board. That's why the deck runs a lot of low cost followers so that they can be fused with Baal to make full value out of it. With this card 6 fused, it's very easy to turn the tides around your opponent and come back from what seems like an unwinnable game. Regardless, this deck is definitely a very strong one. It has really no bad matchups. The only issue I can think of is that the deck is not straightforward to play, so if you're a beginner, you might want to stay away from this deck. This deck's purpose is to hit its own leader as many times as possible during the early game. Once hit enough, a keyword effect called Wrath will activate, and this will turn cards that were once mediocre into tempo powerhouses. It also gets enough heals to cover up for the damage it does for itself. And more importantly, this deck's late game is a massive power spike. Turn 8 Aragavi is one of the strongest turns in the rotation format right now, as not only does it clean the board, but it also has Storm, meaning it can deal damage to the enemy leader. And if that's not enough to finish the opponent off, there's Permafrost Behemoth that can deal 10 damage to the enemy leader if Wrath is active. Overall, this is a really strong deck, and especially after the Aragavi buff, it's been one of the most picked archetypes in the format right now. This deck is the main antagonist of the current format. It takes the ward mechanic and exaggerates it by literally having wards on all the followers. The deck is a defensive monster on its own, but with the new addition of Anvelt and Sarissa, now it also has the potential to apply insane aggression on the early game. The game plan of the deck is to play the combination of Ra dealing burn damage every end of turn, and Wilbert to pressure damage to your opponents if they decide to attack your wards. This deck shuts down almost any aggressive decks as it has a very solid defense. and getting anviled on turn 1 can disgustingly win you easy games. Overall, this is probably the strongest deck in the current meta. It is very easy to play, it has very little bad matchups, and on certain games, if you get the right cards, you literally cannot lose. It is ridiculous. This is the hyper-aggressive Havencraft deck. This deck revolves around spending the first 3 turns to fill your board with amulets. Then once 4 amulets are on board, by turn 4, Selena comes out and opens up all the amulets while dealing burst damage to the enemy leader. And the result is this monstrous board on a very early turn. The deck also has a lot of options to follow up from this turn. One of them being Sophina on turn 5, which can buff all of the followers and make them much harder to kill. And the Temple of Heresy, which can give you an Apocalypse deck very early to finish off your opponent with overpowered cards. Although the deck is strong on the right curves, not getting Selena can be very disappointing as the deck is kind of reliant on that big power spike on turn 4. But still, it's really fun to play regardless. This is a follower-based type deck that uses artifact cards to apply pressure to the board both offensively and defensively. Artifacts are cards that are stronger than normal cards, but you can't have them put in the deck right away, so you can only get them from other cards' effects. The deck also has reliable mid-game chip damage being Absolute Modesty. If no enemy followers are on board, this effect deals damage to the enemy leader based on how many different types of artifacts that you have destroyed. Verx Colony is also a very reliable way of finishing the game by turn 9. Overall, Artifact Portal is an excellent deck. It can dish out continuous pressure through the immense amount of follower it plays, it has continuous chip damage every turn, and it has a reliable finisher. It's definitely an S tier. This deck is as close as you get to being the Exodia of the current meta. If this deck survives until turn 9, with the right combo pieces, it can instantly win the game in one turn. Set combo pieces being Dimension Dominator, Capsule Homunculus, and Awaken Rachna. So the game plan needs you to have Dimension Dominator put its effect on Capsule Homunculus and evolve itself for the effect. Then, on 9 play points, you need to play Awaken Rachna and take Vesha, play the Capsule Homunculus, and then Vesha. At the end of that turn, Vesha will reduce your opponent's max defense to 2, then Capsule Homunculus slaps the enemy leader for 2 damage, dealing exactly lethal damage. So the deck has tools that can draw and cycle cards to get the combo card it needs, and it also has a lot of cards that help it survive and stall. Overall, this is an excellent deck as it's currently the only deck in the game that can do a one-turn kill. The only weakness of this deck is that it loses pretty hard to hyper-aggressive decks. Thanks for sticking till the end. Before I end the video, I want to mention some other decks that I haven't explained in the video. Those decks being Holy Sanctuary Haven, Natura Haven, Item Shop Rune, Dirt Rune, and Highlander Blood. So if you're interested in using any of these decks that I mentioned, feel free to look in the description as I have all the deck lists there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.